believe it or not, right through there, through all that brush, someone was murdered back in 1976. So it's December 1976. Sharon Ryan, or Shen as she was known to those closest to her, was a 17-year-old high school senior attending Jefferson High School in Northeast Portland. She was set to graduate at the end of that school year, end of spring 1977. And after that, she had aspirations of going to New York and continuing to pursue experience and obviously a future career in dance. That was what she was most known for in high school, was being a very gifted dancer. Anybody who knew her said that she had all the talent in the world and all the capability of finding a career in dance beyond high school. So unlike a lot of people, myself included, who had generally no idea really what they were going to do after graduating high school, even as they were graduating, Sharon Ryan had a pretty strong idea of what she wanted to do with her life, what she wanted for a career. And she was working towards it, making great strides towards it. And she'd performed in multiple performances at her high school. And at this time, she was living in Northeast Portland at the home where her sister was living with her husband. And that's where this story begins. So it started here at 2434 Northeast Flanders. This is where Sharon was living with her sister and her husband. And at approximately sometime around 7:30, maybe just a little bit after, Sharon had been baking cookies and realized that they didn't have any eggs. So she left to hit up a local store that was only a few blocks away. And perceivably, she would have started walking this way. We are currently traveling east on Flanders. The store she went to was at 28th and Burnside. We're approaching the intersection of 26th now, so it'd be 2 more blocks to 28th, and then Burnside is just a couple blocks off this direction. Now, no one can say for certain the exact route that Sharon took. She could have turned here at 26th and gone down to Burnside. She could have turned at 27th. She could have gone all the way to 28th and turned down. That seems to be the most logical route to take, especially since off to my right here, there's actually the Da Vinci Art School, and there's like a school complex over here. I'm not going to film it because there's kids out on recess, but that pretty much blocks, it seems, from 26th at least up to 27th here, blocks any way to get down to Burnside. So I personally believe she went straight down to 28th and then turned south to Burnside. And that is the route we're going to take to get to the store that she went to. So again, we can't say for certain what way Sharon Ryan went to the store, but the easiest and most logical route would have been to go straight down Flanders to 28th and just turn and begin traveling south along 28th. Each road, they're in alphabetical order, so Flanders is behind us, starts with an F. Everett is the next building here. That starts with an E. And It just makes logical sense to me that she would have gone this direction to get to the store. So I'm actually along Cooch Street. There's Cooch and 29th, so Burnside and 28th would be just the other side of this building here. And this would have been the area of the store that Sharon went to get her eggs before things changed forever. And there's a Whole Foods here now. And I'm pretty sure this is the building that the store was at. They say it was at 28th and Burnside, but along 28th there's this more thin brick structure that looks like it's just more of a thin line of businesses, whereas this is like an actual store. And that was more where Sharon went. So I believe it was more just off 28th and Burnside, which is up around the corner here. And Sharon did go to the store. She made it from the house a few blocks off that way to this store. She actually made it. And I'm just more on the back side of the store because obviously there's a lot more people there. There's a security dude over there. I don't want him hassling me, thinking I'm doing something strange, just capturing a piece of history that deserves to be preserved. So yeah, the clerk in question remembered Sharon being there. Didn't have like a great, perfect recollection, but this person had no idea that when they were checking this one person out, that was gonna end up becoming this wild case that it became. So the clerk remembered checking her out, remembered she bought eggs, which she came for, and there was apparently something else she bought that, as far as I've been able to gather, continues to loom in mystery. Even like a while after the events of this story, it would still get posted in newspapers that there was this other thing that Sharon bought with the eggs. Kind of still lingered in mystery, and I'm like, why would that be? Wouldn't it just be something normal, like she bought a bottle of soda? Maybe she bought more butter or chocolate chips for cookies or whatever. I don't know. I don't know why that was kept so mysterious, but again, she was seen here. She made her purchase and she departed, heading back towards her sister's home off in that direction. So it's sometime between, I'd say roughly 7:45 and 8 p.m. Again, we don't know the exact time she left. It's been ballparked sometime around 7:30. And it would only take a couple minutes to walk to the store, a couple of minutes inside the store buying stuff, and you're already back on the street going this way. I wouldn't think it would be, if she left at exactly 7:30, she'd probably be making her way back home like no later than 7:45. So while we can't say for certain which way Sharon Ryan went to the store, we can at least infer that she probably was heading back up 28th here. And that is because around 7:45 to 8 o'clock, at least 2 individuals started hearing screams. One individual lived in this apartment complex right here, heard screams that sounded like they were really close by, quickly ran to a window to look out. So I don't know if it was on the front of the building or windows on the side. Couldn't see anything. It was, it's December, it's dark out at this point, so he couldn't see anything. What he couldn't see was somebody at some point, presumably along this stretch, had grabbed Sharon Ryan, and in particular led her back here. Now this was a parking lot, a little parking lot, probably from the edge of this wall here to this building. There was a tiny little parking lot just for people that worked at a building that used to be here, and probably people who worked in this building here. So this was open. Now it was still dark, but somebody had taken Sharon Ryan to the dark recesses, the back area of this parking lot, close up against this wall to this building, and brutally attacked her. While old newspaper articles were a little bit shaky on whether this happened or not, the official cold case report online from the police says that she was sexually assaulted and asphyxiated. It was also reported that she had at least one stab wound to the face, and some reported that she had stabs around her neck, while others said that her throat was just slit. So it was a very horrible, brutal crime that happened in the darkness back here. And what's so wild to me is obviously this case is going to go on to become a case that becomes a cold case and hasn't been solved. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing it in this particular series. But what baffles my mind is, yes, it's nighttime. Yeah, there was no lights in this lot and it was fairly dark. So I can understand someone at a distance, not being able to see anything at night in this darkened area over here. But it shows either crazy desperation, utter confidence, a completely brazen attitude, or straight up ignorance on the part of whoever was responsible, that they would grab this girl and take her down over here, which again, it's dark out, but this is all wide open. And, she was screaming. There was obviously a struggle going on in sounds. And while this area has absolutely changed over time, this is a fairly busy throughway, and there's lots of businesses in here. The buildings that these businesses are in, have been here a long time. It's not like these have just popped up over the years. So, and it wasn't that late. It's 8 p.m. And yeah, maybe it's cold. It's a little more than a week before Christmas. But honestly, because even right now, I've had so many people walking randomly past me. And you can just see, it's just lined with buildings. All it would have taken was one person to walk down this stretch, look over, and even if they couldn't make out details, they would hear the struggles, they would hear the screaming, they would hear the sounds of an attack. And this person would have been busted. All it would have taken was one person coming down here. So despite it being dark, this individual was attacking her in the openness of a parking lot. So again, either the actions of an incredibly brazen individual, an incredibly desperate sexual deviant, or someone who was just not a very smart criminal, and possibly a combination of those things. Can't see it very well, but here's this gray wall of this building. So that's the wall that Sharon Ryan was found up against, near. And yeah, she would have been found more kind of near the back there. You see there's a building far enough back there. She was found more towards that building way back there. So to a degree, the crime scene is still here. The street has been blocked off for traffic. I'm wondering, because I think there used to be another way to get in on the back side of this building, but I'm not sure anymore. So again, this is the building that she was found up against. Yeah, this building is kind of the only thing that's still really around in the immediate area of the crime. So yeah. Right, this is a much better view. But yeah, kind of just right in here. It's more towards this side that I'm on now than the side that I was looking through before, which is way down there. So yeah. Right about down in there is where Sharon Ryan was found. So in the aftermath of what happened here, another thing that's very interesting is Sharon isn't discovered till more than a day later, because it's the evening of December 16th that she's killed. She isn't found until December 18th. So that means, and granted, it was reported she'd been like partially covered with plant matter. So, you know, stuff like this had been kind of rolled over her. But she wasn't fully covered, and I find it bizarre that all through December 17th, she was just back there. But this is open and in broad daylight with all the foot traffic that goes through here. Nobody caught sight of something. You know, saw a little bit of her poking up. Nobody saw anything. Like, she was pretty quickly reported as missing by her family, and they immediately started searching for her in, you know, the general area between their home down Flanders Street, literally just a couple blocks this way, and the store that Sharon would have gone to. And in this initial search, they had no luck, but in a subsequent search, December 18th, that was when they discovered her brutally murdered. We can perceive the crime scene. We have the victim, but nobody saw the person, presumably, you know, at this time, nobody saw the person who grabbed her. Nobody saw anybody flee the scene. The police had their work cut out for them in this particular case. And the early investigation after this event happened and police were trying to put together what happened, there were two things that happened early on that people thought might lead to a suspect. One in particular, or suspects. One in particular was there was a man who claimed to have seen Sharon Ryan at the store here that night. And this individual claimed that they saw two men accosting her, which suggests maybe there were two men that were involved in all this. However, the police pretty much dismissed this account because within that account, this individual discussed talking to an employee that worked here who wasn't there that night. So it was kind of determined that this guy must have mixed his days up. And he was actually here on a different day, which seems kind of strange. You think this guy would have reported this right after? It wouldn't be that hard to remember what you were doing on November 16th, but that was quickly dismissed on those grounds, which I think is a little abrupt, but also it doesn't seem like there was anybody that could verify or validate that this was happening, because apparently this was happening in the store. So if this was happening in the store, there should be, you know, a lot of other people there. More than one person should have seen this, seen someone who was or looked like Sharon Ryan, and been able to validate this story. So that lead went nowhere. And another case was pretty close to the time that the events of this case happened. There were a couple of women that came forward and reported that there was a creepy guy pulling up to them, you know, in his car and trying to woo them to his vehicle. So there was this kind of strange, sketchy guy driving around town. And the details on that were kind of meek in terms of exactly where these encounters were happening. but I read in one newspaper report that apparently those instances were near this area, but still many, many blocks away. That doesn't mean that that guy couldn't have driven his car a few extra blocks and made it to this area. But in that vein, they were actually able to identify the vehicle and thus the individual who was doing that, and it was deemed that there was no connection in that either. So there's another dead lead. And it was suggested one of the last people that may have seen Sharon alive was a man named Frank Shear, who was staying at 334 Northeast 27th, which would be the location of this big house right here. Shear said that around 8:10, he saw a young woman generally matching Sharon Ryan's description. She was traveling southbound, so she was going this way down 27th, and she seemed to be kind of skipping along, almost kind of in a jovial sense. Now, it was reported that, yeah, this is probably the last time that she was seen alive, but I personally think this was just another person. I mean, this is a heavily populated residential area. There was a lot of, you know, girls 16, 17, 18 years old with long brown hair, especially back in the 70s, in this area. It seems to be that the most likely time that Sharon Ryan was killed was at around 8. Latest she would have been killed would have been like a minute or two after 8. So it's about 8:10, and she's randomly over here. That seems to be likely. Whoever this girl was walking this way was probably after the murder took place. And also, it doesn't make any sense, because this would have been, regardless of when she was killed, this would have been after Sharon went to the store. So she would have been coming back this way. Now, the big issue with that is it doesn't make any sense for her to be going south on 27th at this location when the house she was returning to is literally 2.5 blocks directly this way. So why, if she's gotten what she came to get, would she be going down this way when this is the direct route to her home? So I personally think that Mr. Shear, you know, I don't doubt that he saw a young woman as he was peering out one of the windows of this house right here. But based on those factors, I don't think it was Sharon Ryan that he saw. I think it was just another young girl in that had a similar look to her. And that being said, Mr. Shear identified some of the articles of clothing that Sharon was wearing as the same stuff he saw on the girl he saw walking by. But, you know, unless he's getting his time figures wrong, because I could see her doing that on her way to the store, but that would put her back closer to around 7:30, not 8:10. That's a pretty drastic gap in time to get confused by. So we're approaching 41st and Hancock right here. This building is Sam's Hollywood Billiards. You can see the billiard sign through here. And back in 1976, this place had the same name, and there was a 24-year-old guy working here as a janitor, and I think he was also trying to get work here as a bartender, and his name was Robert Ernest Wood. And yeah, so you can see it's got the same name. This is where he worked back in the 70s. Now, why am I mentioning a random building several blocks from where this crime happened and a random guy that worked here? Well, Robert Wood was about to become a pretty significant figure in this case. Now, why is this Robert Wood of interest in this case? Well, Sharon is found on December 18th. The following day, December 19th, authorities get an anonymous call from someone who refused to identify himself at first, but later was discovered to be a guy named Stan Tover. And Stan Tover and Robert Wood knew each other. They weren't really close friends, but they drank together, they'd hung out. He'd known Robert Wood for a few years. So he would know this guy, you know, if he saw him on the street. And he tells law enforcement, he gives him this tip that he actually saw what he thinks was the final moments right before Sharon Ryan was killed, and that Robert Wood was her killer. Now, on the night of November 16th, as Stanley or Stan, kind of went both ways, as Stan Tover described it, he started going out and hitting up some local bars in this area. And the first place he goes to, he has eyewitnesses that verify he was there, so that part of his story is accurate. But after going to that place, he ends up here at 30th and Gleason at another tavern that was located in this building here, and it still says it's a pub. So not too much has changed. I think it was called the Ship's Keg at the time, and he claimed that he had 5 beers while he was here, and then he departed from here and began traveling westbound towards 28th and Gleason. And he had a very particular reason for doing this, which was something he used to justify that he was absolutely certain what he witnessed on this night. It was December 16th, and the time and everything matched up with when Sharon Ryan was reportedly killed. Now, after arriving at 28th and Gleason, I'm not exactly sure, but Stan Tover went to another bar at this corner. I don't know, maybe it was in this old building. I'm not sure exactly where this place was. They didn't give any explanation of the address, what corner it was on. But Stan Tover said when he went to the other establishment here at 28th and Gleason, he had called his mother, because his mom lived in Ashland, and she was supposed to be having surgery soon, and he was calling her up and checking in on that. And he said that using the circumstances of that, he knew exactly what night this was. Now, granted, when he reported this to the police, it wasn't even 3 full days after the murder had happened, so he still shouldn't have had that hard of a time realizing what was going on. But after placing that call, and presumably it's like at least the 3rd bar the guy's gone to, he has a few more drinks, claims he's not drunk, even though he's probably had at least 8-9 beers at this time, which I guess if you spread that out over a few hours, it's not that bad. But he starts going south on 28th from Gleason. And only 1 block south of that, we're at Flanders. And just off that intersection, we have the location where Sharon Ryan was murdered. And Stan Tover says that as he's passing by, he sees Robert Wood, and he's having like a fight with someone. Now, I'm not sure which side of the road he would have been on, if he was on this side or walking down this side. But again, here's where the parking lot would have been. And he sees a guy who he clearly identifies as Robert Wood having a struggle with a woman right in this area. And he decides, despite seeing this, because apparently he's such an upstanding guy, he decides, none of my business, I'm gonna keep on walking. And Stanley Tover just keeps on walking while a woman, presumably based on his story, is about to be murdered back here. So he reports this to the police, and they don't really have a lot of other good leads, so they start looking into it. They start monitoring this 24-year-old janitor, works a few blocks off this way, and finally feel they've got enough to arrest him. And on December 30th, 1976, 2 weeks to the day after Sharon Ryan is killed, Robert Wood is arrested for her crime and prepped to be put on trial. Now, the key issue is there isn't really, besides Stan Tover's account, there really isn't anything else to really tie Robert Wood to this crime except, one eyewitness account. So, in hindsight, I'm looking back in hindsight, it probably wasn't the best thing to try to take Robert Wood to trial based almost exclusively on that. And what's so interesting is, Robert Wood lived in the area. That's one maybe piece of circumstantial evidence, is he did live in the area. He worked several blocks kind of off that way, and he lived a couple blocks down this way. What's interesting is he lived on Ankeny Street. He lived just a few blocks directly south of where Sharon Ryan was living. They lived almost perfectly in line with each other. If you look at a map, going north and south, their homes were almost perfectly lined up. Doesn't mean anything, it's just kind of an interesting observation. And Robert Wood he kind of had an alibi, almost. What's really interesting is, as I'm passing by, the building here, and then the Whole Foods is on the other side of it, coming back to Burnside and 28th, is at about 7:30, right around the time Sharon Ryan would be leaving the house, Robert Wood had gone to this same store and was heading home. So you could suggest, okay, maybe he went to the store a little later than he said. Maybe he lingered in the area. Maybe there's a way that both him and Sharon Ryan are kind of in this area, getting closer to 8 o'clock. But it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, because Sharon Ryan will be going off this way, and Robert Wood lived more off this way. He would have been going a complete different direction from her. So, what was he supposed to have, like a sixth sense, and just know that this young girl was randomly going to show up at the store not too long after he left? And here's essentially the sort of alibi that he had. So this is Ankeny Street that I'm walking down. I'm walking in the direction of the place where Robert Wood was reportedly at around the time that Sharon Ryan was killed. Now, an acquaintance of Robert Wood's, a guy named Dennis Smirl, S-M-I-R-L, said that he saw Wood around 7:45 p.m., kind of in the vicinity of his home, which would kind of make sense. We're only a couple blocks from the store. He goes to the store at about 7:30, leaves maybe around 7:40. It would be about 7:45 that he would be in this area. And he says that he and Robert's brother Benjamin Wood had both seen them, and that they were all going to their mom's place, which I think maybe Robert and or Benjamin lived there with them. And they arrived shortly before 8 to watch the Dick Van Dyke Show. And Robert Wood verified this, but he said that he just watched the Dick Van Dyke Show with his mom. No mention of Smirl or his brother being there. That's maybe a small detail, maybe a detail that was mixed up, but it's of minute interest. And the place where this all supposedly happened, where they gathered to watch the Dick Van Dyke Show, was in this apartment house right here that's called the Clarkton. This is where at least Robert Wood's mother lived, and that they supposedly spent. This is where they reportedly were when Sharon Ryan was killed, just watching some old school comedy. So the idea is, if you can rely on these witnesses, which of course, this one witness is his friend, he might lie for him. The idea is that they're back at the apartment house here, probably just a little bit before 8. Probably around the time, if not a couple of minutes before Sharon Ryan is killed. So it's kind of an alibi. And it was a Christmas episode of Dick Van Dyke. Of course, it's 9 days before Christmas, so that makes sense. And they actually showed the episode during the trial, during Robert Wood's trial. And they asked him, details about what he'd seen in the show to kind of prove that he was there. And based on what he remembered seeing in the episode, it was actually suggested that he'd missed about the first 10 minutes of the episode, meaning he probably didn't come home till about 8:10. Now, is that proof? Is it possible he came home and was doing some other stuff between 8 and 8:10 and didn't really settle down to watch the show with his mom till 8:10, but he was still there by 8 o'clock? That's, again, this is all, entirely based on the accounts of people that would have, if you're trying to protect a friend or a loved one, you'd have a reason to possibly be deceptive about these stories, but also it could just be that this is absolutely what happened and these people were telling the truth. So, who are you going to believe? Robert Wood and his friend, possibly some family members? Or are you going to believe Stan Tover's story? Well, authorities had to believe that Stan Tover's story had a lot to offer because that's primarily what they were relying on. And a pretty key issue is that even by the time the trial came around, it was known that Stanley Tover had lied to law enforcement on multiple occasions. He was this anonymous caller, but he lied initially about being that. And his attitude was, much like when he presumably saw Robert Wood struggling with a woman, his attitude was he didn't want to get involved. Don't get me involved, I don't want to get mixed up in it. And he told this really bizarre story about, a couple weeks after this murder happened, he claimed to have seen a guy who looked exactly like Robert Wood. And this is after the actual Robert Wood had been arrested on this case, so obviously it couldn't have been him. And it seems like he was maybe trying to weasel his way out of his, because he was in. He was the not only a key witness, he was the only witness, the star witness for an upcoming trial. And you could say, oh, well, I saw this other guy who looked exactly like Robert Wood later on. Maybe that was the guy I saw attack Sharon Ryan. And maybe, if that's the case, I don't know who this person was. And, you can kind of get out of having to be a witness. This guy didn't want to get mixed up in it. And that didn't do the prosecution any favors because they were relying solely on this guy and a court of law as the star witness. And he's already, when you've got a star witness that's lied about basic stuff and even made up this bizarre story about a look-alike, that alone in most trial juries, that's enough right there to create reasonable doubt. And once reasonable doubt exists, you can't find someone guilty. And if that wasn't enough, Stanley Tover's ex-wife, a woman named Maxine, she came forward and said that, Stanley Tover was a pathological liar, essentially, and also he would, if he could get attention, he would do things to make it happen, such as interjecting himself into a murder case where he didn't actually witness the murder so that he could be the all-important star witness, which kind of flies in the face of Tover's behavior, which was, once he realized his importance in this case, he tried to do what he could to get out of it. So, this was his ex-wife. They'd obviously had a tumultuous experience together, so Was this an ex-wife trying to help authorities? And, you know, a jury realized that this guy was unreliable and that someone should not go down based solely on the words of this guy? Or was this just a vengeful ex-wife who saw an opportunity to embarrass her ex-husband? Obviously, only Tover's ex-wife could answer that question for certain. And to try to counter Tover's ex-wife, his mother was also spoken to, and she verified, she said that Stan had called her personally and told her about witnessing this altercation that was happening, that there was this guy, you know, that he identified as Robert Wood, or Bob Wood, is how he knew him, and he was like aggressively pulling on a woman's arm, and then he, you know, walked away from it all. So she verified that, you know, he had told her this, which lends credence to the idea that he had really seen this, but this is the guy's mom. I mean, if anybody's gonna lie for somebody, it's probably gonna be their mother. So you can't really go on that too much, but okay, fine. If the witness is not super reliable, like, there has to be some evidence out there to show Wood's guilt if he in fact was responsible. And a criminologist was brought in, a guy named Michael Howard, who analyzed like tiny little specks of paint that had been found on Sharon Ryan's clothes at the crime scene. He compared this with paint that was on the kind of pole that goes across your closet that you hang your clothes on. For some reason, the name of that is escaping me. And he reportedly told police that the paint types were a match, which isn't definitive guilt, but it just shows that, you know, there's something interesting there. But on trial, Howard recanted that statement. Now, Howard also tested traces of blood that had been found on a pair of Robert Wood's pants. So maybe there's a lead there. And he determined that they were of bovine origin. So it was like cow's blood. And that was when it came out that, in addition to being a janitor at Sam's Hollywood Billiards, Wood was also trying to become a bartender and work more closely with food there. And that included the handling and preparing of beef. So there was an explanation for why there would be bovine blood on Robert Wood's clothing. So there wasn't really anything of like evidentiary value from the crime scene or anything like that that you could really use to definitively tie Robert Wood to this crime. So then you have to think, well, what about, I mean, if Robert Wood, this 24-year-old, you know, janitor slash aspiring bartender, if he can just grab a woman off the street and murder her so viciously and so brazenly, like, wouldn't there be some red flags in his past? Don't you think there'd be something? There was some strange things he did as a child, and that led to a bunch of people being called to the stand to testify on this guy's character, the people that had known him since childhood. And one individual that was probably pretty significant to his case was a woman named Mina Brannick. Just make sure I'm pronouncing it right. And she was a rancher living out in Baker, way off Eastern Oregon. And they had taken in lots of foster kids that they'd watched over. And Robert Wood was one of these kids. And she said that, you know, they pretty much, despite the foster parent to foster child relationship, she pretty much regarded him as her son. And she said, you know, he was always just a really great stand-up guy, and a guy that genuinely cared. She said that when her husband ended up in the hospital, Robert Wood went out of his way to make this long trip just to go visit him, to check up on him and see how well he was doing while he was staying at the hospital. So that certainly didn't help the prosecution's case that this guy was a, crazed psychopathic murderer. And beyond that, there were actually a few other women that were brought up who knew Wood personally, were friends with him, had spent time with him, spent time alone with him, wherein he could have, if he wanted to do something, he would have had an opportunity. There was one particular friend of his that was, I saw reported on in newspapers, named Judy Hopple, who expressed, much like the rest, that Robert Wood was a perfect gentleman all the time, and that they'd spent, they'd hung out a lot. They never dated or anything like that, but she said that, if given the opportunity, he never ever forced himself on her, and that, they spent time alone. He would have had opportunities to do that if he wanted to. So none of these witnesses helped even push the angle that Robert Wood had something inside him that made him do something as vicious as what happened to Sharon Ryan. And now these certainly don't prove beyond any and all reasonable doubt that this guy maybe did have something he was harboring, something that just those around him couldn't see. Crazy psychopathic killers are actually pretty good at that. But if that is the case, it wasn't being brought out at trial. And there was no way anybody could say beyond just speculation in and of itself that Robert Wood had any violent tendencies, that he had any hostilities towards women, that he had any demented, depraved sexual desires. If any of that existed, it didn't come out then, and I haven't found anything about it since then. So by the conclusion of the trial, there already had to be so many doubts creeping in. Standover's questionable reliability as a witness, and there wasn't any evidence to definitively tie Robert Wood to the scene. As far as I've been able to gather, there's nothing that indicates that Robert Wood and Sharon Ryan ever knew each other. It's a hard, a lot of people who are attacked are often attacked by people they know, but in Sharon Ryan's case, this is somebody who's maybe just a victim of opportunity for some predator in the area. She happened to be in a given place at just the right time for the wrong person to be there. I have the feelings, based on the circumstances of the case, that this was probably a complete stranger that did attack her, so I guess that doesn't necessarily make Robert Wood look any less guilty in that dynamic, whether they knew each other or not. But they couldn't even find anything in Wood's past that would indicate that he had any violent tendencies, any murderous tendencies, any psychological issues that might make him snap and want to kill somebody. No signs that he had any severe violent hostilities towards women. There was not a lot there. So when the jury did leave to deliberate, they ended up taking a vote to determine which way they were going to go, which I guess might be a way to avoid, if not everybody is in agreement, you could sit there forever. And they voted 11 for acquittal, and one of the jurors put up a vote for guilty. So because the not guilty side wanted 11-1, they came back with a verdict of not guilty. And regardless of whether Robert Wood was guilty, the circumstances of the trial, I don't see how any jury could have found him guilty. So was this a carriage of justice to some degree. Did the actual killer get away with it just because there wasn't enough against him to convince a jury of his guilt? Or was a completely innocent man vindicated and spared potential life imprisonment for something he never did? We don't know. We can't. Robert Wood can never be tried for it again. If he is still alive, I have no idea. He would be probably in his early 70s by now. So he can't be tried again. So he could have at any point come out and said, hey, I did it. I mean, it wouldn't benefit him in any way, but all circumstances considered, I have a hard time believing that he did it. I have a hard time believing Stan Tover's account of events. And that was the only trial held in relation to Sharon Ryan's murder. And it was held a couple of months after her murder. So we've had nearly 45 years since then. And no one of any real substance, at least anybody that could be genuinely arrested and put on trial, that there would be enough evidence to do that with someone else. That has not happened in the prevailing decades. And unfortunately, pretty much since the acquittal in that case, there hasn't really been nothing that I've seen, nothing that's been reported. There really hasn't been any advancements in the case since then. Here we are 45 years later, and 44 plus years of that time, there hasn't, again, at least to my knowledge, I haven't seen another even likely suspect come up. And in one post I saw, and I don't remember if it was on Reddit, if it was on Web Sleuths, it was something like that, someone expressed the feeling, the perspective, which I can understand and sympathize with, is that the police were convinced that Robert Wood was guilty, and they're still convinced he's guilty. So their attitude is, well, it's solved, just the jury got it wrong. So what can you do? Which is, if that is the case, that is so disgusting. And I know I spent a lot of time talking about Robert Wood and his trial, and I always try to keep these very focused, obviously, on the victims more than the suspects. Again, we don't know if Robert Wood is the guilty party. But I mean, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to delve into that, is because that's the only real legal proceeding that was conducted in relation to this case. And it seems like it's just been sat on for years. And, if that attitude is accurate, that the police are just kind of like, well, we got the right guy, they just didn't convict him, what do you want? And they're just going to sit on this and not do anything, that's disgusting. Because, first of all, no, you don't know that this guy was guilty. And the fact of the matter is, when all is said and done, the only strong thing you have is you have one guy who proved to be unreliable, at least to some degree, saying he saw him in that area around that time, and he was like pulling on a woman and having a fight with her. That's all you have. And unfortunately, sometimes eyewitness accounts are all we have, but eyewitness accounts are some of the most unreliable pieces, if you can even really call them pieces of evidence, that we have. A photograph, security footage, a recording of someone admitting to a crime in a situation where it's not being coerced out of them. Those are reliable. Somebody saying something, that person could have misjudged what time it was. He could have been confused about where he was. He could just be flat out lying. When you pretty much just have one guy's story, that's not enough. So, regardless of what anybody thinks, no, there is nobody that can, in all honesty, without bias, say, I know for certain Robert Wood is guilty of this murder. And because of that, the attitude about this is a cold case that from what I can see, has been neglected ever since early 1977. And Sharon Ryan deserves better than that. She deserves to be paid the exact same level of care and concern as any unsolved murder case in Portland. And because of the simple fact that you cannot say for certain that Robert Wood was guilty, you need to continue pursuing this case as though the person responsible is still out there. And I don't know, in recent years, how hard that effort has been, if any, but, it's sad that Sharon Ryan's case has kind of become another one of these cases that just the further away we get from what had happened, the more and more it just kind of fades into the background. And, when the anniversary comes up, one of the news channels will do a 60-second segment on it. Who killed this person? We still don't know. Maybe we'll know someday. Isn't that sad? And then everybody goes back to forgetting. Except, of course, those who are actually close to the victim in this case, who have to deal with, you already have to deal with the pain of the loss of a loved one. And on top of that, you have to deal with the stress and the trauma of not knowing exactly who was responsible and whether they'll ever have justice served against them. So Sharon Ryan deserves that justice, and she deserves that work. And if there's a cold case unit that has worked on it or is working on it or is going to work on it, they need to take this stuff seriously and not just say, hey, let's try to figure out if we can railroad Robert Wood a little more. If they have reason to look at him if they have more evidence on him, and they can maybe prove that it's him, even if you can't try him again, and that ends up being the fact of what happened, then that's the reality of what happened. If it's somebody else, the same thing. But this is a 17-year-old girl who had a bright future, who just wanted to make some cookies, for God's sake. And that ended up costing her her life. Everything gone. So, that's why I continue to do videos in this series, is because these people didn't deserve this shit. And these people deserve justice. And they deserve the hard work of investigators who shouldn't be just pawning off the problem so they don't have to worry about it anymore. Friggin' web sleuths theorizing online should not be working harder than law enforcement who's actually in control of these cases. And I just see too much of that. I see too much of that. Well, it's a cold case, so it'll probably never get solved, and that's an excuse to not work hard on it. And obviously there's exceptions to that. Some cold case units have worked extremely hard and found solution to cases that sat unsolved for decades. But there's too many cases like this that are just kind of sitting around, not making any progress, and it doesn't really seem like, just from where I sit, from what I've seen, I don't really feel like the effort has been put forward in this case. And yet, even with that, I hope that changes at some point. And I hope, that this is a case that's, only 45 years old, and while that's a long time ago, we've seen cases much older than that get solved. And we found out who was responsible and taken them to task. And even if it's somebody who's maybe not alive anymore, we still at least know who was responsible. That's why I keep, as I said before, that's why I keep doing this series, is so that these people don't fade away. They don't become forgotten to those outside of those that were, immediate friends and family. Even if only a couple hundred people watched this, it was still worth the time and effort for what these, what so many people have been through. And that's always been why I do this. So, like the many cases I've discussed before this one, and like the cases I will discuss after this one, my only hope is that Sharon Ryan someday has justice served for her. And that said, I would like to thank you all so much for stopping by watching this video. I have a lot of videos in this series, trying my best to keep a lot of these cases from the Portland area and Oregon as a whole alive. Some of them are more well known than others, but at the end of the day, these are all people, and they all deserve to be remembered. And this is my little way of keeping them from being forgotten a little bit more. And I'd like to thank all you for watching, and I will see you next time.